This is the Best or Worst podcast. And now, here are your hosts, Koji Stephen Sakai and M. Martin Mapoma.
Welcome. This is Koji.
And this is Martin.
And this is episode number 36 of the Best or Worst podcast.
That's right. And I am so excited about today because I've been waiting for this interview forever.
Oh, wow. This is that. You weren't as excited about other people? This is.
Yeah, not really.
Okay. Well, with that being said, we have a really amazing guest, Ann Burroughs. She's my, to put all the cards on the table, she's my boss. She's my boss at the Japanese American National Museum, but I've known her a long time and I love her and I respect her. So that's why we needed to get her on this podcast. And why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself a little bit?
Okay. Hi, it's really good to be here. I've been looking forward to this too, I have to say. And, you know, Koji always knows what side his bread is buttered on. So he does. I mean, for him to start off by saying I'm his boss. No, but I've known him too, and I just have the most incredible respect for him, and he knows that. So I feel very lucky that we have the relationship that we do. So as Koji said, I'm the president and CEO of the Japanese American National Museum, and as you hear from my accent, it's not an American accent. I'm a South African. I have all of the deep vowels that South Africans have. And I've been here for, almost 30 years. Well, in fact, it's just on 30 years, which is just extraordinary to me. And I came to this country with my ex-husband, my son's father. He got a Fulbright scholarship. He came to this country, and I always thought I would only be here for 2 years, and it's been all of this time. But I, was very, very involved in the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. So when I came to this country, I was very lucky to be offered a job by Amnesty International. And Amnesty I worked for them for 9.5 years. And then after I left Amnesty, I just sort of went into this world of sort of consulting and running organizations and doing a lot of international work. But, certainly I was actually talking to somebody earlier on, and they were asking me about South Africa. And I just said, it really has absolutely fundamentally shaped who I am, and it's certainly, my lessons there, the things that I learned there, absolutely they influence my life and inform all of the choices and the way that I analyze my world. So what else do you want to know?
That's amazing. I got to tell you, I have to harp in here. So I'm from Zambia, Africa. And so listening to Ann talk, listening to you talk in that accent just brings me home because I went to school with a lot of South Africans. A lot. I almost went to school at Waterford in Swaziland.
Oh, you did? Oh, my
almost.
goodness.
No, almost. Oh. That's a whole other story, but I have a lot of friends who went to school there.
Yeah.
But, with the apartheid movement, growing up in Zambia, because I've been here since 1984. Mm-hmm. And so I remember it vividly, the freedom fighters coming through Lusaka and, and of course with Nelson Mandela. I actually even remember Stephen Biko when he was killed. I was, 11 years old, I think, but I remember that so strongly. And then, you being incarcerated in South Africa for apartheid. I mean, it's just amazing to me because it's one of those things where, people here always talk about white privilege now. And, Koji always makes this great analogy, explaining white privilege to someone is like trying to explain water to a fish. Growing up in South Africa as a white South African, whether you're Afrikaner or, English, dealing with apartheid is something that you could have easily sidestepped and never felt any of the ramifications or the consequences of it. And the fact that you chose to deal with it head on and go through what you went through, I can't begin to tell you how, amazing that is for me. It's awe-inspiring. It's just amazing. And I really want to thank you for, not so much having gone to prison, but, I want to thank you for helping with that struggle because I don't think people here understand the gravity of what that means. You know, we can go to a protest here, but we won't get thrown in jail for it. You know, unless of course, you know, we destroy property. But it's what you did was amazing, and I can't express that enough to you. It really means a lot.
Well, thank you.
Was there a question? I don't think there was a question in there, but
no, I was just giving her a shout out. I mean, nice. it's.
I'm just joking, Martin.
I know you are. That's your boss. That's right. I'm sorry, I forgot.
No. Well, I mean, how does those, you know, what was the moment that you? I've never talked to you about this really, but you know, what is the moment that you decided that you wanted to do something, that you didn't want to just sit back? And what was it? Was there a singular moment, or was it something that you felt always? Can you go into that a little bit?
You know, it's hard to know if there was a singular moment. There was sort of events that led up to, I guess, that, you know, that sort of catalytic moment. But I guess the catalytic moment for me was the 1976 uprisings, you know, which is sort of commonly referred to as the Soweto riots. Yep. But in fact, there were, you know, uprisings throughout all of the country. And, you know, I'd sort of taken a bit of a walkabout away from, you know, my university studies, and I went and trained as an X-ray technician. So I happened to be working as an X-ray technician in one of the largest hospitals in Cape Town, as the townships were erupting. So it was also at a time when there was incredible state control of the media, and we just got television in South Africa. That was in 1976. So what we were seeing on the screens were just these sort of enormous protests going on in the township, but the narrative coming from the government was that, you know, these kids were throwing stones you know, that they were the attackers and they were attacking police. I mean, absolute rubbish. And working in the emergency room, of course, the lie was just so unbelievably clear, because, you know, the kids were coming in with bullet holes in their backs, you know, and that for me, I think was certainly, I mean, I'd always sort of been relatively liberal, but that really for me was the sort of catalyzing moment. And then, you know, shortly after that, I started working in mobile clinics. We would go around to the townships and X-ray, do chest X-rays of people. And really, I mean, as a white South African, you talk about privilege. It's extraordinary, because the division between white South Africans and black South Africans then was so extraordinarily stark, you know, and the only contact you had really with people, I mean, as a privileged white South African girl, the only contact I had with people of color were as my, you know, nannies or gardeners or, you know, the driver or whatever. So I got involved in doing these mobile clinics, and it was the first time I ever went into the homes of people of color, and it was the first time that I ever went into townships in South Africa, and the first time I ever saw how, you know, black people lived, and the disparity was just so extraordinarily stark. So I mean, that was definitely the sort of catalyzing period. You know, 1976 in South Africa was definitely it.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah, that's, you know, it's funny because you mentioned being a liberal, and I really believe that liberal or conservative shouldn't necessarily dictate how you feel about race, you know? And it's interesting because I have a lot of friends who are pretty conservative, but when they bring up race, they're like, whoa, that's not what, you know, I think it's one of those things that's been sort of hijacked, over here at least. You know, the connotations of liberal or conservative aren't nearly as strong as they are, aren't as strong anywhere else as they are here. But yeah, you know, I never thought about that. I didn't realize that South Africa didn't have television until 1976. You see, for us living in Zambia, you know, South Africa, for example, all the missionaries living in, you know, Southern Africa, when they went on vacation, they always went to South Africa for vacations.
Right.
Which always blew me away. I never understood that. You know, they come here to spread the word of God to Zambia and all these other countries, but they go to the most racist country in the world to vacation. And that always, you know, I just, okay. But TV, South Africa had everything in our eyes. As a kid growing up, you had everything there, all the food, all the good, you know, the sweets and candies and things like that. And so to hear about television, you know, not being available.
So imagine what it was like coming to this country, you know, at the age of, you know, whatever it was, the age that I came. And, You know, all of the things that are totally baked into your DNA as Americans. I mean, all of the cultural references that you have, that you just know, whether it's music, whether it's a TV, whether it's, I mean, all we had were American movies.
Yeah.
American movies and a very small slice of, you know, of American music.
Yeah.
But, you know, growing up, you either went to, you know, everything was segregated movie houses, or you went to the drive-in with your family, and even the drive-ins were segregated. You know, there were a few roads for Black South Africans, and, you know, majority, the pound seats were always for. But coming here was just, I mean, they're just cultural sort of vast deserts between, you know, what, and I still often play catch up and sort of have to struggle. So for me, working at a Japanese American National Museum, there's another whole overlay of, you know, Asian American culture, which I can never, I will never, ever be able to. I'm very aware of the fact that there is an enormous amount that I don't know. And, you know, Koji can certainly tell you, you know, the number of times where I've sort of had to step back and say, you know, I'm not the spokesperson on this issue. This is not something that I feel comfortable speaking about, you know, or I would go, I needed constantly looking advice.
How did you end up with the Japanese American Museum?
So I came initially as an interim president and CEO.
Okay.
It was there was a sort of between leadership, and I did that for about 9 months, and then the trustees asked me to stay, and I was extraordinarily surprised because I felt that it was really important that the leader be Japanese American. But I think it was, you know, at the time it was 2016, it was just after the election. There was everything that was happening, everything was going down, and there was just this incredible sense that, you know, democracy was under threat. And I think that for the trustees, they felt that I would bring, you know, possibly a broader perspective on civil rights and social justice, because I also have a really large, you know, so much of the work that I've done in the sort of rights movement has been internationally. So I suspect, and I've had experience running big organizations, so I assume that those were the things that mattered for the trustees.
Can I ask you a question real quickly, Ann, because this has actually come up recently, you know, because I still have family in Zambia and a lot of family in South Africa, actually, you know, and you know, I'm just curious to what your take is on what's going on in South Africa with the farmers and the killings over there. Because there's a real, you know, push and pull going on right now with people trying to, especially now, trying to equate that to what's happening with George Floyd.
Right.
You know, I have friends I went to school with who are like, well, what about, what about what's happening to the farmers in South Africa? No one's talking about that. And then, you know, I hear, you know, all these rumblings of people like, well, you know, chicken's coming home to roost. And I'm always like, I don't know if I can get on board with that. But I just, and again, I don't mean to put you on the spot with that, but
No. I mean, I can give you my opinion. I'm not there, and I can sort of give you my opinion and my analysis of what it is. But, you know, at the root of it all was that, you know, we fought a revolution in South Africa, and we won, and we did, but we didn't do the work to make sure that there was the transformation that was needed.
Yeah.
And a critical piece of that transformation was obviously restitution, and certainly, you know, a more equitable economy, and a piece of that was land and land restitution, and that never happened.
Yeah.
So, you know, you have centuries of dispossession, you know, generational dispossession, but then you have to balance that against the fact that, you know, you can't, if someone gave me a farm and told me to farm crops or, you know, grow cattle or whatever, I couldn't do it because I don't have the experience.
Yeah.
You know, I think that there have been some really just hideous things around, you know, crime on farms and murdering.
Oh, yeah.
You know, seizing of farmland, but it's not anywhere near at the level that it was in Zimbabwe, for example. And I mean, one can't celebrate the loss of life at all. I know that there are people that do. But I certainly don't, you know, and I think that the government is charged with an enormous responsibility to get that right.
Yeah, it's interesting. You're right about Zimbabwe. And it's funny because now Zimbabwe is trying to get the farmers to come back, you know, because the economy has been collapsing.
Yeah.
You know, the whole thing is just so messy, but you're right. You know, there was nothing in place to really help with the transition. And I think there are a lot of people that are still smarting from apartheid rule, who are old enough to have not forgotten. And unfortunately, I think they've passed a lot of that hatred and anger and resentment on, to their children. And I think on both sides, it's at the risk of sounding like that idiot, out there in DC. It's just a horrible situation, because I love South Africa and I love their people. And so a quick question, because are you British or Afrikaner?
I'm both.
I only say that because it's interesting. I read an article 4 or 5, maybe 6 years ago that was very fascinating, how the Afrikaners and the people of color in South Africa, when independence came around, they really sort of glommed onto each other, because for some reason they were much more of the earth. And for some reason, the British South Africans who had helped with the fight for freedom felt left out. And it was a big article. It was very fascinating to read. Mm-hmm. And did you ever see that? Did you ever experience anything like that at all, or?
No, not really.
I'm sorry. I'm making you my expert. I'm asking you all the questions that I had in my head.
I would like to.
Hold on. Anne's looking at me like, what the hell is he talking about?
No.
Well, I would like to say, I think that to Ann, your point, I mean, I do think that's one of the problems with this country itself, is that we've never done truly reparations or reconciled the tragedy of the slavery plus Jim Crow plus segregation plus everything. And I think that's one of the problems that's going on today, is that we've never had a reckoning. We've never really repaid, whether momentarily or monetarily, or even just as a true apology. And I feel like, one of the big issues with what's going on now is that we really, really need to have that, all of us in a room, like, so to speak, and really just, being honest with what the country did and how we became America, which is, on the backs of slave labor.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think
all right. Yeah, we're at the time. It's that time.
We're at the time where we ask our guests the best or worst moment of their lives. And again, it's not a moment where it's like when they met their spouse or when they had a baby, but it's kind of like something that really affected them, whether it's a day, whether it's from childhood or adult, it doesn't matter. So, Martin, what do you want to hear the best or worst moment from Ann?
I want to hear the best, because I'm sure Ann has plenty of moments, especially working in South Africa, that I'm sure would just be mine. I'm on the fence. I can go either way. I'll give it to you. No, because, I feel like, first of all, I had 1,000 questions to ask her when I found out we were having her on, but I feel that, I can go either way. So I'll leave it up to you. You'll be the deal breaker, because I'm totally happy to hear the best or hearing the worst.
Oh, wow. This is shking to me. I wasn't prepared for this.
The pressure, Koji.
I'm all like pressure. Yeah. It's like I have to
it's always Koji making the deal.
All right. Well, I'd love to hear because, as you say always, Martin, the time is challenging with all the things going on in the world. So I'd love to hear kind of the best moment. So, Ann, what is your best moment, the best moment of your life?
Gosh. That is, it's hard to quantify, because I think that we experience the best and the worst in so many different ways, and I think we experience them in different ways on different days. We experience the same thing in different days. But I think that for me, the best, certainly one of the high points in my life was the way I experienced Nelson Mandela's release. And that really was. It wasn't just the moment, although that was just extraordinary, but it was what it meant and what it symbolized. And it also, because of the time in my life and where I was in my life, it was just that whole, the sort of sense of euphoria over that, 2-week, 10-day period from the time, when we knew that he was going to be released to when he actually, walked through the prison gates, and probably, the couple of weeks afterwards. So it was this sort of moment of euphoria, but it wasn't, one particular thing. And, it really was because it was, by that point, I'd been involved in the struggle for several years. I'd been part of the African National Congress. I'd been part of, Martin will understand all of that. But, I'd been out of jail by that time for, I think it was 3 years. And I was, working at the South African Council of Churches, which is the sort of the big, large interfaith group in Johannesburg, which was one of the few organizations that wasn't banned. So all of the sort of resistance organizing, happened out of our office. But I remember we got word from the big English language newspaper, from one of the journalists of the English language newspaper, that they'd been given a confidential briefing by the government that Mandela was going to be released in, a week, 2 days, and then he's going to be released the next day. And I remember running, literally, there was our building, we had 7 stories in our building, in our new building, because our old building had been bombed. But we had 7 stories in our new building, and I remember running down the hallways and just screaming, Madiba's coming out, Madiba's coming out, and then getting on the phone. And I was the special advisor to the General Secretary, Frank Chikane, who eventually became, Chief of Staff to President Mbeki. And Frank wasn't there, and I couldn't reach him, so I was calling around to try and reach him, and everybody I was talking to, I actually called the ANC officers. Well, we were still banned at that point, but the leadership, and I said, this is happening. They said, what do you mean? I said, it's happening. And they were literally, within 10 minutes, we had dancing, not protests, but we had dancing in our street outside the building, and the word just spread. So, and then we knew that we weren't quite sure when he was coming out, but we thought it was going to be the weekend. And I remember my ex-husband and I went to go and see Lawrence of Arabia. It was this colorized version of Lawrence of Arabia. There were no cell phones. We were in this movie house, like this film that went on forever. And I got home, and there were all these messages waiting for me on my answering machine. Where are you? We've got a plane. We've chartered a plane. We didn't charter it. We were given it by one of the sort of captains of industry to go down, because we've got to organize. We now have to go and organize, help organize the, his welcome. And there was a lot of planning that had been done, but to sort of, welcome him and, do the big sort of welcome rally in Cape Town. But by the time I got home, the plane had taken off. The plane had taken off. So I remember that sense of, I just wept. First of all, I wept with joy, but I also wept because I couldn't be there. And then the next day, obviously, was the Sunday when he was released. And I was left at the SACC, and Jesse Jackson had actually come to South Africa and had insisted that he be there that he be in the country when Mandela was released. So we also didn't know for sure when Mandela was going to be released, but it was really, really hard for us to be getting the country ready to welcome our leader, but also to be able to have to deal with this incredibly high profile, important American guest. And I remember I had to go into the office the next day, and we had to cancel the program that we had arranged for him, because he was going to go to various cities, because he decided that he was going to fly straight to Cape Town. So we actually had a stadium of people in one of the cities, and Volkswagen, the motor company, had given their employees off for the whole day to go and attend a Jesse Jackson rally. But Jesse had gone straight to Cape Town because he wanted to go and greet Mandela. So we had the stadium full of workers from PE, that Port Elizabeth, that had been. So there was just so much. There was just, the euphoria was, it's hard to even put into words that sense of, the joy, jubilation, euphoria. It doesn't even begin to explain. And it's not because you love your president or you love your country, but this was a man that symbolized everything about what was unjust in South Africa, but everything about what courage and fortitude and leadership and magnanimity and vision. Every one of those values that you want in a leader, that you want in an icon, was there embodied in this one man. So it was extraordinary. So that was the high point. That was the high point of my life.
Yeah. That's, I remember like it was yesterday. I think I was here And everything you're describing is exactly how I felt. Wow, that feeling was amazing. I can't imagine what it must have been like for you, being there, and I'm sure you probably can't watch Lawrence of Arabia anymore, right?
Never. And I mean, I remember we went to see it, and I mean, we were both, I mean, I was a, sort of ideological leftist at that point, and we both were, and it was like, oh my God, this is such a colonial film, and it's like British colonialism at its worst, but it is a colorized version. And what are we going to do? We're waiting for Mandela to get out. What are we going to do? Let's go and see Lawrence of Arabia.
That's the irony behind that. Watching a movie on colonization, being in a colonized country that's about to be free is unbeatable. That's amazing. That really, really is.
And I was going to say, sorry.
No, just real quickly. Were Mandela and Jesse Jackson in contact while he was in prison?
I'm not sure. You'd have to ask. You'd have to ask the Reverend. You'd have to ask the Reverend. I'm sure that they were, because he was in contact with, Madiba was in contact with a lot of world leaders, certainly towards the end, before his release.
Yeah.
I know it's not the same thing, but I was going to say that, when in 2008, when President Obama was elected, I mean, it's not the same thing, but I remember. I remember what?
No, go ahead.
I remember feeling like America is finally fulfilling its promise, in that, because both of you guys, I grew up here and I dreamed of being president, but I knew instinctively with the guy with the name of Koji and Sakai and the way I looked, that there's definitely no way I could ever be president. I mean, when I realized that, I just was like, I'm not a politician. But then when President Obama became president, it was really the first time that I was like, wow, this could actually, and then it all fell apart later, obviously. But at that time, at that moment, I mean, I was like, I think it's probably the last time I cried for anything good, right? Where it's like, it was such an important moment, I think. And the Mandela one is like 100 times, more like, obviously on a bigger scale, but I just like taking a fraction of that for me was just to understand.
No, Barack Obama was a big one. I was just messing with you. But when Barack was elected, I remember standing outside of my house and yelling Obama into there and crying, and it was just mind-boggling. I still have the newspaper from the day after.
I do. I have the handbag. I have the newspapers. I have the Time magazine. I have all of them. I have all of them. But, I mean, in many ways there are similarities, because it was it was just on on a symbolic level, and just the kind of deep kind of emotional chords. That thing of hope, and there is nothing more powerful than hope. There really isn't.
Yeah.
Because it really is, it's with Obama, it was, things have an opportunity. There now is the chance to change.
Yeah.
Things will be different. Things can be different. I mean, of course, looking back, we've all learned, many lessons. But, certainly in the euphoria of that moment, there was that same incredible, I mean, I will never forget the speech that he made in the Middle East when he was it the speech that he made in Egypt? I mean, that was just one of the great speeches of all time.
Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing.
Well, I think we're nearing the end of it, but I wanted to ask you kind of what's going on now with your work in South Africa, but also your work at the Japanese American National Museum. I mean, when you look at what's going on in the world with all the the George Floyd stuff and everything else, how do you look at that, and what's your take on everything as a person who's gone through so much?
Well, it's always informed by my early years. It's always informed by South Africa. I may have mentioned at the top of the program that I'm also one of the global chairs of Amnesty International. So, so I always look at things from a rights perspective and a social justice perspective. And so it's hard for me just to look at it from the perspective of the Japanese American National Museums. And I'm not being interviewed here as, the CEO and president of that. It's just, but for me, it's really, I think that there is, in amidst all of the anguish and the extraordinary anger, it feels to me as though there is, again, hope, that there is, hope in the sense that, it's forced it's forced a reckoning. Yeah. And, you know, what comes with that reckoning is the knowledge that people have to change. And I think that people are even beginning to talk about, certainly white people are beginning to, you know, talk about privilege in a different way, you know, and even although white people don't necessarily understand it and understand what it means, I think that at least there is a sense that they're wanting to learn, which is a good thing. You know, I would never ever try to speak for Black people in this country. You know, I can only look at it from my perspective, and I can only look at it from a rights perspective. But, you know, what you have is this extraordinary uprising, this extraordinary sort of sense of renewal and purpose. I mean, absolutely single focus purpose on making sure that things change and that things have to change. And that, you know, there has to be a reckoning with systemic racism. You have that. And then on the other side, you have a leader who traffics in fear and division, you know, somebody who fans the flames of hate. But, you know, he's not alone. And I think we always blame him, but we also have to remember that there's a context. We all know that. I mean, there's a context that gives rise to that. And that is where the, you know, and unless there's just an enormous amount of healing and change, and people have to listen. You know, that's the thing. And it's often the hardest thing to listen to things that are uncomfortable and challenging. And that's what's been one of the extraordinary things about all of these, about the protests, has just been this incredible sense of white people are just waking up, you know, waking up to what the experience of it is to be somebody of color in this country. I read somewhere that, and I can't remember who said it, but it was so smart, I thought, about, you know, about white privilege. And, you know, it doesn't mean, for some people, you know, it doesn't mean that their life won't be hard. You know, each one of us goes through different things, but the difference is that, you know, it's not the skin color that will be the reason for your life being hard. You know, so, I mean, I just thought that was a really good, it was an explanation actually that was used for elementary schools, and sort of having elementary school students try and understand what privilege is, and, you know, sort of privilege and how that's linked to skin color. And I just thought that it was just enormously powerful, you know. And if our kids can understand that, you know, my son is mixed race. His father was not, you know, was not white. But I think that if we can all teach our kids that, you know, it would be just enormously important.
Ann, how do you, I'm glad you said that, or, you know, you brought that up, because my son is mixed race as well. And I don't think Koji understands. So in Africa, there's, you know, they're called colored if you're mixed. And that's a whole different group of people. I don't know how old your son is.
Oh, he's 27. So
okay. No, my son's 8. And, you know, he's now starting to hear about, you know, what's going on here. And it's so tough, you know, having to, you know, to shield him from it and explain it to him. Even my wife has really opened her eyes in so many ways that have been, and you know, the best way for me to explain it is that now that her eyes are open, she's absolutely terrified for him. And I have now, you know, for once in my life, become an expert on something, because, as Koji will say, she's definitely the better half. But, you know, I have to let her know that it's going to be okay, that he can handle these things. You know, she'll find herself getting really upset with things that are coming, you know, that are being said, and, you know, on television. And, you know, and I just tell her, look, I may not get as mad, but I do. But unfortunately, when you've dealt with it for so long, it's just one of those things. One last thing, though, Ann, I got to tell you, you know, and there's this climate of white people not wanting to say anything because they don't want to offend anybody. And I keep telling them, I would much rather come from a standpoint of you trying to say something and them being redirected to what you really should say, as opposed to people who are silent. Because the people who are silent, they speak volumes. You know, volumes more on how they feel about the system than those who try to say something. And if anybody has earned that right, I believe it's you.
And I would like to say, I agree with you. And there's been a change. I mean, you know, a couple years ago, 3 years ago, me and my son were protesting Black Lives Matters. We're the only non-Black people in the crowd. And then today, the other day we were in South Pasadena, which is this bastion of like whiteness, right? And everybody there was, and people were there, and their families there, they're older white people. I think that there's a change that like 3 or 4 years ago, Black Lives Matter was a very niche protest movement, right? And I think that there has, it's still like, obviously there's still a lot of other things that are going on, but I think there has been a turn in a lot of ways that I think is different, and I think there's hope. But on a negative though, I think it's going to get worse the next 5 months until the election, because I think that there's going to be just a lot more of a division for the next 5 years or 5 months.
Well, I think that it's going to require an enormous amount of vigilance from everybody to make sure that there isn't an escalation of coercive powers, whether those powers are explicit or implicit, and what I really, really worry about is, the First Amendment issues, the right to protest. I also really, really worry about, attacks on the media. And I also really worry about how kind of blinkered really most of the media is, in the sense that they sort of toe a line, and it doesn't engender debate. And that's which is why podcasts and sort of using different mechanisms are just so extraordinarily important, because the way the structures of the media are balanced today is that there just doesn't allow that kind of debate and that engagement and that sort of real perspective of views. So, I worry about that. And I really worry about the fact that, I think back to, the Occupy movement, and it was incredible. We all got so excited about it, and it was enormously important because it brought a lot of things to the fore. But we also, if we look back on it, and we sort of have to ask ourselves completely dispassionately about what it achieved. I think that, some people would say that it achieved a lot, but I think that we need to make sure that this time around there's a very, very clear agenda.
Very true.
That those reforms, it's not just reforms. We don't just want reforming of the police departments. We don't just want, reforming of the use of force. We don't just want the reform of, the use of coercive powers, but it's actually fundamentally changing them. And how do we go about, systematically dismantling, the racism that permeates every single sector and echelon of the society.
Yeah. Very well said, Ann. Thank you so much for coming on. Coach, I think we'll have to wrap it up here.
Yeah, we're going to wrap it up, but thank you so much, Ann.
I wish this had been an hour-long conversation, because I feel like we could talk, especially with the climate going on right now. I felt like this conversation could have gone on for a long time, and I hope people take the chance to listen to this, because, Ann, I think you have so many good things to say, and especially, again, with your experience, I can say these things and Koji can say these things, and unfortunately, people might take it as tongue-in-cheek, but I think coming from someone like you and the experiences that you've had, I think more people will listen, because what you said is very true, especially when it comes to, dialogue. I find myself, constantly thinking about that, with people. When people start talking in terms of libtards and and right wing this and left wing that and all these things, it just descends into this chaos where there's all this name calling, that's just not productive. Nothing gets done.
And interestingly enough, just the last point I'll make is, to go back to an earlier question about what the Japanese American National Museum is doing and what we can do. It's such an extraordinary place. It has such an incredibly important voice in the civil rights movement in this country. What happened to Japanese Americans. But I think that one of the most powerful impacts that we can have is to be able to be a place where we can bring people together to have conversations about those difficult things, and to have conversations about that rollback of rights, and to have conversations about how we reopen that space and have people listen to each other, really listen to each other and talk to each other. Yeah. But it's been wonderful to be part of this. I wish we had an hour too, because I suspect the three of us could, maybe when this is all over, we'll get together for dinner.
Yeah, I think we should. That'll be amazing.
Well, thank you, Ann, and thank you, Martin. So please, for everybody, please rate, review, subscribe to our podcast. If you want to be on the show, if you have a best or worst that you think that we should be talking to, please hit us up on our social media. It says Best or Worst Pod on Instagram, Best or Worst Pod on Facebook, or even Twitter, because now apparently I'm checking Twitter, so it's great.
And also, and one more thing too, guys. If you want to be on the show, also we want to hear conflicting opinions. Everything done with respect and dignity, because Koji and I can agree on a lot of things. But to have someone come in with a different take on what's going on even right now, I think this helps bring more clarity to what's happening. Okay?
Wow, I'm not sure I want to talk to somebody who has a different opinion, but that's okay.
I know he's good.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, everybody.
All right.
Thank you, Ann. Thank you so much.
Bye. Bye-bye.